Well, hello there, my friends. Welcome to today's episode of Stand Up, where my guest is a very special host of NPR's morning edition for almost 2 decades, one of the most recognizable voices in all of America, and the author of a new book, Differ We Must: How Lincoln Succeeded in a Divided America. Steve Inskeep is right here on Stand Up, coming up at about 11 minutes, just past 11 minutes in, I start my conversation with Steve. I thought I would be reading a history book, but it's as much of a self-help and enlightening on how to have healthy conversations, debates, and negotiations to get what you want in the long run. Real good book. Love talking to Steve. I think you'll really enjoy that. But first, it's time for a bit of a news recap from over the weekend. And even before that, just want to say thanks to everybody who was hanging out with me on Friday night, the rare Stand Up with Pete Dominick Friday night hangout. And it was great. I think we were there for about 2 hours. Really enlightening, deep conversation about whether or not people are born or can be evil. It was like a 45-minute conversation with several folks weighing in. I very much appreciated the thoughtfulness and tenor of that talk on Friday night. And if you are a stand-up subscriber, I'm including a private link to my YouTube channel that you can watch and listen to that hangout in today's email to subscribers to the YouTube page that is private only for subscribers. If you want to go watch the hangout from Friday night, you can. Oh, and while you're there, subscribe. YouTube.com/standupwithpete. I've got almost 2,000 subscribers there, so it'd be great to pass that threshold. Also, I hope that you watched me on MSNBC. On Friday night. It was the 11th hour on Friday night. A lot of people did watch, got great feedback from a whole bunch of listeners. I really appreciated that. And finally, just wanted to mention I'll be in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, co-headlining City Winery in Pittsburgh on October 11th. Tickets available in the show notes. I'll be there with Cauvin. Looking forward to that. Hopefully, I know a few listeners that are already coming. Pittsburgh, October 11th. And finally, and as a way to get into the news, this Wednesday night, there is the second Republican debate. And I hosted a hangout for the first one. And because I won't be able to host our hangout on Thursday night because I'm speaking in New Hampshire for New Hampshire Democrats have asked me to come up there and talk with them. And by the way, I've invited my friend Jeff Charlotte, so it might be a sit down. I might tape it. Either way, I'm going to meet and talk with the New Hampshire Democrats about local organizing stuff and learn a bit from what they're doing as well. I'm definitely no expert, but they invited me up there. So Thursday, I'm going to be doing that. Wednesday, I'll be hosting the hangout for the debate. So I'm not sure what time. Maybe we'll start like an hour before the debate starts, but I will be hosting a hangout this Wednesday, not Thursday. All right, well, one of the biggest news stories starting on Friday, of course, is that federal prosecutors in a 39-page indictment accused Democratic Senator Robert Menendez, the powerful New Jersey senator and chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, of accepting bribes that included the luxury car, expensive exercise machines, mortgage payments, bars of gold bullion, and more than $500,000 in cash. Also, apparently his fingerprints are on the bullion, and there were actual internet searches on his web browsers and computers where he was looking to see exactly how much it was worth. He literally typed in an internet search the day after he got this gold. How much is 1 kilo of gold worth? This is Menendez's second indictment, by the way. He's maintaining his innocence, accusing the Manhattan federal prosecutors who brought the case of misrepresenting routine congressional work and also playing the race card, saying it has something to do with him being a powerful Latino. I know he mentioned something about that, but he's accused of using his official position to influence arms sales and U.S. aid to Egypt. The indictment says that Senator Menendez took action to help a company that was paying his girlfriend. Prosecutors are saying that Senator Menendez accepted money and valuable items in exchange for meddling in a prosecution and criminal investigation. And of course, now the senator is facing calls to resign and at least one new primary challenger. Just some of the details about this case, which is really, really bad. Obviously, for Senator Menendez, his family, and his career, not to mention my friend Alicia, who seems like such a great person. I've known her a long time, and she's an anchor over at MSNBC who really does a lot of really great work, wrote a great book. I hate to see this happening. Obviously, obviously is going to affect her, is affecting her, I'm sure. But what does this mean for Democrats and the Democratic Party's brand? Well, we got to get rid of this guy immediately. We cannot have a guy with these kinds of charges, much less an indictment like this one from the federal government, the Department of Justice, which, of course, just another Democrat that Biden's Department of Justice has weaponized against. When you see Hunter Biden being indicted and then Senator Menendez being indicted by Joe Biden's Department of Justice, it's not Joe Biden's Department of Justice, it's not the president's Department of Justice. Yes, he appoints the attorney general, but they are supposed to be separate and uninfluenced by each other. And it would seem that Merrick Garland is that, very independent, very careful about how the White House communicates with the Department of Justice, the FBI, etc. And of course, he's gone after Hunter Biden and a Democratic senator now indicted. So it's hard, it's ridiculous to make the case that the Department of Justice is weaponized against Republicans when it's also obviously gone against the president's own son and a senator in his political party that he's mostly allied with. But of course, none of that will stop Donald Trump and MAGA Nation right-wing media from continuing to make the argument and the talking point that so many people unfortunately get convinced by, that is Biden's Department of Justice, all these political witch hunts after Donald Trump and Republicans. Of course, former disgraced president, for his part, over the weekend suggested that his former Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley, who's been much in the news recently because there's a new Jeffrey Goldberg Atlantic article about him. Anyway, the former president suggested that all Americans should be celebrating Mark Milley's retirement. That's the other reason he's been in the news. He's retiring. He said that the general would have been executed for treason in times gone by. Also, Congressman Paul Gosar of Arizona said something similar, calling for the execution of Mark Milley in a very homophobic Sunday, deranged even for him rant. Congressman Paul Gosar used his weekly email newsletter, which is hosted, by the way, on a .gov domain that's funded by American taxpayers, to launch a thinly veiled homophobic attack on Joint Chiefs of Staff Mark Milley, shockingly suggesting Milley should be put to death. And the argument that a lot of folks are making on yesterday's news cycle and the Sunday shows is that that is something that should have been more focused on, specifically the former president suggesting that in times gone by, Mark Milley should be executed for treason. And yet that wasn't leading the Sunday shows. It wasn't even really mentioned on the Sunday shows. What they did mention a lot about was an ABC White House poll that had Donald Trump beating Joe Biden by like 10 points. And at 14 months from the election and at least 2 election cycles where polls got a whole bunch of things wrong, I'm with all the critics who say the Sunday news shows really missed the mark on what the lead story should have been. Also, a lot of people I follow and trust were outraged by a Washington Post headline about General Mark Milley retiring that said, General Mark Milley, polarizing Joint Chiefs Chairman, exits center stage. Jeff Charlotte tweeting, polarizing? Really, Washington Post? Because he refused to go along with a coup? This is disgraceful. That's just one of many, many comments about that headline. Mark Jacob also tweeting, the Washington Post calls General Milley polarizing because he tried to prevent Trump and his fascist gang from endangering our national security. What a bunch of both sides bullshit. And just getting back to that poll, you may have heard about the ABC Washington Post poll that had a shocking outcome. It was released on Sunday, showed President Biden trailing former President Donald Trump by 10 points. Well, it was savaged by a lot of the experts I certainly respect, like Larry Sabato, who publishes the widely read Sabato's Crystal Ball. He slammed ABC and the Post for putting out a survey which they themselves referred to as an outlier. He said, ignore the Washington Post ABC poll. It's a ridiculous outlier. Trump up by 10 over Biden, laughable. My question, how could you even publish a poll so absurd? On its face will be a lingering embarrassment for you, is what he wrote. Just plain embarrassing, he said. Nate Cohn, New York Times chief political analyst, also noted the Post and ABC poll as an outlier. They referred to it themselves. He says, I have a fairly major quibble with the poll. If you release consecutive outline polls, you don't get to dismiss your results. If it happens twice in a row in the same race, it's clear that this is the result of some element of your approach, and either you need to decide you're good with it and defend it, or you need to go home. Mehdi Hassan says, LOL, there are outlier polls, and then there's this one from the Post ABC today. If anyone wants to believe that Trump has a 20-point lead with young voters, I have a degree from Trump University for them. So I guess don't pay any attention to that poll. Don't be worried about that poll, or really any 14 months out, I'm not concerning myself with it. But that won't stop the chatter about replacing President Biden with somebody else. I'm not engaging in that, not today. I am, however, calling for Senator Menendez to resign. I saw this from Jed Lugham. Number of Dem senators who called on Al Franken to resign over allegations of sexual misconduct that did not result in criminal charges, 35. 35 Democratic senators called for Al Franken to resign. Number of Democratic senators who have called on Bob Menendez to resign after being charged with felonies of brazen corruption scheme, 0. Yeah, why is that? Still haven't figured that out. Yesterday, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez called for him to resign when asked about it on CBS's Face the Nation, but I haven't heard any sitting senators call for it, and that's troubling. I hope that changes tomorrow and the days to come. All right, well, that's all the news I've got for you. That's what I was paying attention to in the political world, other than the looming government shutdown, which there's not much development on that. I know Republicans were still fighting over the weekend, so I'm following that one closely. That, and of course, over the weekend, the sports media industrial complex will now have to replace the Coach Prime Colorado miniseries with the Taylor Swift, Travis Kelce, Kansas City Chiefs miniseries. That's a tweet from a guy named John Ziegler I saw. Because, well, if you know what I'm talking about, you know what I'm talking about. If you don't, I'm sorry for wasting your time. Let's now get to my conversation with Steve Inskeep, shall we? Steve, of course, the host of NPR's Morning Edition, as well as NPR's Morning News podcast, Up First. He's known for his interviews with presidents, congressional leaders, and, of course, less famous people like truck drivers and coal miners, U.S. Mexico border detainees, Yemeni refugees, California firefighters, American soldiers, because Steve Inskeep has been at this for a long time. He's reported from Afghanistan, Iraq, and so many other war zones. He's the author of several books, but his new book, the one we're talking about today, it's called Differ We Must, How Lincoln Succeeded in a Divided America. And he does this really good job of looking at Abraham Lincoln's life through 16 encounters, some well-known, some obscure, but all imbued with a new significance in this book. Each interaction with a person who differed from Lincoln, and each someone that wanted something from the other. And it really was illustrative and enlightening to me. I felt like I was getting advice on how to negotiate and how to get what I want out of a relationship, any relationship. And it, in some ways, was like a self-help book to me. And I told Steve this. It got a little sappy, I think, kissing his ass about it, but really did make me, I felt like I learned a lot. And while Lincoln didn't always change his critics' beliefs, many went to war against him, he did learn how to make his beliefs actionable. And it's really fascinating, this book. I loved and am loving reading it, and I really enjoyed my conversation with Steve. I hope that you'll look him up on social media and let him know that you heard him here on the show, and I think you'll get a kick out of and really enjoy the book, hopefully in a way that I have been, that affects the way that you think and talk and relate with folks maybe. So really good stuff. I loved it, and I hope that you enjoy my conversation. Let's do it right now for the first time ever with Steve Inskeep. Oh my gosh, ladies and gentlemen, Steve Inskeep, what are you doing here? You just interviewed one of the most important leaders of our time and the talking heads. Why are you in my shed, sir?
Well, this is now my third really big get today. I get to talk to you this time. So Thanks for the welcome.
It's Volodymyr Zelensky, the talking heads, and this guy. I am so excited to talk to one of the most recognized voices in America and one of the most respected journalists. And congratulations on your book, which we're going to talk about. You're a student of history. You're an author of history. So this is really exciting and special, I'm sure, for you.
Yeah, I'm thrilled to have this out in the world. Or a little anxious, actually, because you never know how it's going to be received. But it's great. It's great to be at this moment. Well,
the most obvious question for you, your editor, your agent, and everybody in the world is a Lincoln book? Let's come on. I think it's been written already, but I'm reading your book. I love it, and I'll tell you why. But what's the answer to that?
Oh, I'll do my best to answer, but I want to find out what your answer was.
Yeah.
There's been like 15,000 Lincoln books or something like that. There's a huge stack of them in one of the tourist attractions here in Washington, D.C. But Lincoln has a lot to say, and there's a lot about Lincoln to explore. And also the other thing that changes is like the time frame. There are different things to say about Lincoln today and our situation that seems relevant today than maybe 10 years ago or 20 years ago or 50 years ago. And I just ended up thinking there was something that I wanted to explore. It's kind of, Lincoln's interaction with me and with our time.
Well, you nailed it there at the end. That's why I like reading it. And I'm going to tell you more specifically why. And I think listeners will appreciate, because it's very relevant for a lot of reasons. But I think I first have to ask you how you wrote this book. Differ we must, how Lincoln succeeded in a divided America. Steve, you feature how many? 13? I'm on number 5. And, well, I did skip ahead to get to Frederick Douglass, I confess.
Yeah,
but
people do.
How did you write this book? Like, set it up for folks.
Yeah, well, my original thought was I wanted to tell Lincoln's life story through his meetings with, a diverse group of people, because America was very diverse then, just as it is now. And I wanted to get a sense of the whole country from the way that he interacted with different people. And I realized it wasn't actually a story about diversity. It was a story about disagreement. And what I needed to focus on was his meetings with people who differed with him, who brought a different background or perspective, or who thought he was totally wrong, or he thought that they were totally wrong. And that there was something in those arguments that I wanted to understand that related to our divided time now. And so I went back in. There's a ton of Lincoln material because people have researched him so much. There's every word he is confirmed to have written or spoken is in like a single set of books, like 8 thick volumes. So you read a lot of that. But I went around to historic sites. I got documents from different places. I spent time in the Library of Congress. And just tried to absorb all this material and think about the parts that felt relevant to me now.
So all of the chapters have a title and then the name of the person, and I'm going to run through them because I think it's that good. Provocateur is one guy, Joshua Giddings. I won't say all their names. Provocateur, partisan, extremist. Well, we start with protagonist Abraham Lincoln. Nativist, fixer, conspiracy theorist, outcast, editor. As I say these, you could think that there are people in media right now or in life right now that certainly fit those titles, no different than now. Emissary, strategist, sovereign, dissident, activist, that's Frederick Douglass, soldier, Justice, and First Lady Mary Todd Lincoln. And you talk about the negotiations, the arguments, the debates, the fights that he had with all of these different people. And the reason why I like it, because as an American, as a media person, a pundit, a journalist, a comedian, a cultural commentator, whatever people want to call me, I don't know. I don't have a good brand, Steve. I'm learning that I am often shitty at listening. I'm often bad at listening. I'm often decided what the other person is going to say. All of the things it would seem Lincoln was smart enough to or learned not to do, it really applies to everybody working in media and every citizen and family member to try to understand where another person is coming from. Because if they can be this way about slavery, I can be this way about democracy, climate, and racism, which are all very, very serious.
Did you ever watch the Quentin Tarantino film Pulp Fiction?
A long time ago. Go ahead.
Okay, so there's a scene where one character, Travolta's character, asks, in a conversation, do you listen or wait to talk?
I'm sorry, I was waiting to talk. What were you what were you saying? I have a question about your book.
Yeah, but there's a lot of value in listening, and I think people have gotten frustrated with it, especially in this political environment. Everybody's divided, and you see your uncle at Thanksgiving, and you just think this guy's batty, and you can't talk to him, and you want to be away from that person. And you even think, there's kind of a political school of thought that it's like a betrayal to talk to the other side, or that it's naive to talk to the other side because you're never going to persuade them. And I think Lincoln got right beyond that argument in his own divided time, because he realized, I may not change the other person's mind, but I may still find a way to work with this person in some limited way, to deal with this person, or even because he was a politician, maybe there's a way I can use this person, even if I can't really work with this person. I can advance the next cause. And that's just a different deal You don't come into a conversation with your uncle that you think is politically batty, thinking that you're going to change this person's worldview. Because how would you do that in a conversation? The guy's, 52 years old or whatever, and he's had many years to develop his thoughts. But maybe you will find out the one thing you do agree on, or the one thing you don't really agree on, but you agree on the right thing to do at the moment. Or even if you don't agree on anything, at least you understand them as a human being. Those are useful things.
Sure, but you're talking about listening and understanding. But Lincoln, as you write in this book, did all of that. But he also used people. So if it's your uncle, and if it's my uncle, and he's super racist, and I can't deal with any of his opinions on anything, but my engine is broken and he's an engine expert. Well, you know what? I'm not going to choose this stupid battle that's not going to change, because he's still an asset to me. I'm saying, like, selfishly, he can do something for me. So why burn him down here? Seems like a short game over and over in every chapter here. It seems Lincoln understood that at all levels. Take it from there with any example.
No, you're making a great point. And Lincoln sort of did what, the thing about your uncle with the car engine. Lincoln did that on a grand scale with one of the famous Civil War generals, George McClellan. They didn't agree on anything. They didn't agree on how to fight the war. They didn't agree on slavery, really. McClellan only theoretically agreed with the general idea of emancipation someday, but not right now. And Lincoln was coming around to the idea that he needed to do in the Civil War the Emancipation Proclamation to at least decree the freedom of those people who were enslaved by rebels, Confederates in the South. McClellan never agreed with this, but Lincoln, having battled with McClellan for a year, had constant heartburn with McClellan for a year, having even removed him from command, realized in an emergency he needed a guy to command an army, and he reached out and got McClellan. And McClellan delivered for him a victory at the Battle of Antietam. And that victory got the Union cause going in such a way that Lincoln felt, now I can issue the Emancipation Proclamation. It won't seem like this desperate bid for a losing war, because suddenly now we're winning the war. We got a victory. So he used this guy, McClellan, for the larger cause. McClellan's interest was he wanted to be a great soldier and win battles and so forth. And he also believed in the country. Didn't agree with Lincoln about slavery really at all. But Lincoln was able to make use of where they did agree to advance the cause of ending slavery.
You point out one of the really interesting things for me. I'm reading so much, Steve, about philosophy and self-help these days. I'm a middle-aged man. Don't judge me. You know how it is.
I'm not judging you. I'm not judging. I'm listening. Go on.
And Lincoln, as you write here, had an understanding of human nature based in some philosophy as well as seemingly his own childhood experience, that people do things in their own self-interest. And I would argue that hasn't changed since Lincoln's time. A lot has, but he understood that. And so when he would be negotiating with any one of these folks that you feature, talking with them, campaigning, knocking on doors, he understood that first and foremost. Take it from there.
Yeah, he realized the other person was going to ask, what's in it for me?
Right.
And he knew that about himself, too, really. I mean, he had a broad sense of national purpose and so forth, but he was also an ambitious guy who wanted to rise in the world and be successful. But he realized he needed to engage the interests of the other person. He realized how important that was, and that people's interest or self-interest shaped them. And that affected the way that he approached slavery. It's kind of strange to think now, given our discussion about race and racism and so forth, he didn't really try to guilt people into feeling differently than they did. He didn't necessarily blame people for their beliefs, but he tried to show them why it was in their interest to support equality in America. And if they couldn't support total equality, he wanted to show them why it was in their interest to support a little more equality in America. And he would say to white voters, it was an overwhelmingly white electorate, you need to worry about slavery because you are free and you're in the free labor system. You're in the labor market and slavery competes with you. And if you're not careful, you don't think there's slavery around here in this northern state, but it's going to come to you if you don't fight to contain it. He was telling them what was on the line for them. And really interestingly, and perhaps controversially today, he also was saying, I don't want you to have contempt for the white man who supports slavery. He was born into that system also, and he's doing what he thinks is in his self-interest. Our real enemy here is not the individual who is wrong, but the system, which we need to contain and hopefully someday destroy. That, I think, is a really interesting and provocative way to think about things. And it comes from realizing that it grows, people's behavior grows from their interests in some sense.
Diplomats and statesmen, or if whatever they are, or if they're still around, they are negotiators, lawyers, mediators, and generally smart people understand a lot about that psychology that Lincoln understood. Yeah. But when it comes to those of us arguing about politics, thinking about these issues, and I'll use myself as an example, I didn't know that for a long time. The argument or the idea that guilt didn't work. So I worked a long time in environmentalism and still do in climate. And I was given a talk to young people, Steve, and this older mentor of mine, who's a psychologist, said, hey, love your passion, love what you're doing, love your message, but you are guilting these young people. And that won't work to create effective change. And I was humble enough to be like, well, I'm for creating effective, long-lasting change. I'm for doing the thing. So it seems that Lincoln understood, to get what he needed to get done, understanding self-interest issue, that you have to put, to some extent, your passions aside. You can still be righteous, but you have to be careful to get them to sign and compromise. And that is, go ahead. I mean, I was just going to say.
No, you're doing great. And I really appreciate you raising this. I think about environmentalism all the time, and I think about climate change all the time. It is in some ways a similar problem to slavery. And I don't mean to compare them exactly or to say that, the enslavement of people is the same as the climate. But what I mean to say is that it grows out of our economic system. It grows out of the way that we live. It is a thing that we're doing that is objectively bad, according to all the science, but that many of us get benefits from. And that makes it hard to engage everybody's self-interest in the idea, or everybody's interest, let's just say interest, in the idea of changing what we do. And it would be nice if human beings were different, but they're not. And that in some way has to govern the solutions, doesn't it? I think about the various things that people talk about to fight climate change, and telling people don't eat meat is probably a good one, but it's a really hard sell, because people are like, I don't want to change what I do. I don't want to change what I eat. That's like really personal. What's the matter with you? But there are other things that I think are much better for this. The idea of changing our sources of electricity, which has got to be the single hugest thing we can do, right? I think that can be sold as something that is generally a benefit for people because it creates jobs, and it doesn't affect your daily life that much. Your more efficient house doesn't really affect your daily life that much. Your car that is still a car but runs on electricity instead of gasoline doesn't affect your daily life that much, as long as the technology gets good enough. And I think that does create room for, shrewd or clever people to push for climate solutions that act on people's interests.
Well, a smart salesman could do it. And Abraham Lincoln seemed to be a pretty smart salesman. For me, I've realized that these arguments, my old arguments, don't work, even if they were convincing to me. Guilt doesn't work. I have to do what Lincoln did, make it in their self-interest. So if my guy doesn't believe in climate change, he hates liberals and progressives and everything Democrat, I say to him, hey, that's fine. Do you like paying nothing for electricity on your house? Because I don't. He's like, wait a second, what? I love that. Okay, well, come over and look at my solar panels. I'll split the $250 that I get for the referral with you. Everybody's a winner. So it's like that self-interest argument, no matter what we're talking about, should always be made. And Lincoln made it. And let's dig into some of the things. I mean, like we can do this. This is a book interview. And I feel like Steve Inskeep can easily, I could just say a name of one of these chapters, and you probably could talk at least a little bit about him because you did so much research without having it right in front of you. But I'll pick just many of these names I did not know. Joshua Giddings, though, might be one of my favorite characters.
Oh, I'm glad that you raised him. He's one of my favorite characters, too. he is somebody who many of his contemporaries thought he was a. Are we allowed to be slightly profane on this program? What's the rule?
Only Steve Inskeep.
Okay, so I'm sure a lot of people thought he was an asshole. He was an anti-slavery guy. He was from Northeast Ohio, Ashtabula County, Ohio, and he was elected to Congress, I believe, first in the late 1830s. And he was then in this institution where they were afraid to talk about slavery. It was actually against the rules. It was felt it was just way too divisive to talk about slavery in Congress. And there was what's called a gag rule against discussing anti-slavery petitions in Congress. And Giddings nonetheless raised a resolution having to do with a controversy on slavery. And his colleagues in the House of Representatives voted to censure him. He later supported a third-party anti-slavery candidate, which betrayed, in effect, the people in his own party, the Whig Party, and they ostracized him. Lincoln got elected to Congress as a young man and was not nearly as radical as Joshua Giddings, but they lived in the same boarding house, and he realized he liked this guy, and more important, he realized he could work with this guy. And they collaborated in an ultimately unsuccessful but really interesting effort to get slavery banned in the District of Columbia. And they tried to do that by getting some very conservative people to sign on to the idea. There is a lot to criticize about this effort, including the fact that it failed. But I find it really interesting, and it illustrates Lincoln's political style, and for many people over history, an effective political style of trying to collaborate with lawmakers that are really not on the same page as you, but you find something fundamental, something of principle that you agree on. When it comes to the idea of slavery being wrong, Lincoln and Joshua Giddings totally agreed, and so they were able to work together.
I'm trying to find the part that specifically lays out what Giddings decided to do, but he...
Oh, go on.
Well, I mean, you just said it when you talked about him getting censured, but like the shorter version of what you said, I can't find the exact passage here, and I underlined it. Giddings joined the fight in 1842, introduced a resolution relating to a controversy on slavery. The House voted to censure him, as you just said, you write. He resigned his seat, went home to Ohio, and was returned to Congress in a special election. By 1844, the House gag rule was overturned, and that gag rule is something that's really important to today's world. Now, I don't know if you can pick up there on what that gag rule was, but the point I was making is that Giddings was like, no, I'm against slavery. Censure me. I lose my office. I'm against it. That's what I read when I read about this guy. That's my interpretation, short version of that chapter him.
No. That's awesome. It's a great description. The gag rule was specifically about anti-slavery petitions. You know, there's the right to petition in the Constitution, and it's a fundamental thing that you're supposed to be able to do. And it used to be a bigger deal than I think it is today. Like to get a bunch of people to sign a piece of paper and send it to Congress, and they are supposed to think about it in some way. Not necessarily act on it, but at least consider it. And this was considered way too divisive. There were all these anti-slavery petitions demanding an end to slavery in the District of Columbia, where the U.S. Capitol was. And Southern lawmakers considered all of this an affront. They considered speech about slavery to be equivalent to violence, essentially saying that talking about freedom for the enslaved will encourage slave revolts and kill white people. Obviously, Giddings had a very different point of view, and he allied with a more famous person, John Quincy Adams, the son of a president who became president himself, and after being president was a member of Congress for a while.
Which I thought was, I didn't know that, and thought, what an ego hit that might have been, but he seemed to be a pretty healthy guy in mind.
Yeah, apparently so. I mean, Adams was another person that some people really did not like, but he's a fascinating character. And just the idea that you would step down from the presidency to be a member of the...
Well, but just going back to the gag order and going back to, I feel like there are parallels of that today.
There are parallels in everything that you just said. I mean, the whole idea of let's not discuss sensitive things because they're sensitive. And I think you can find that on the political right. You can find that in the political left. You can find that in book banning. You can find that in some of our debates over progressive language. And so that's a very human
but I think
thing,
that what's important to me when in that conversation, this phrase cancel culture is fascinating to explore. But what we're talking about when it comes to speech and what you're talking about here at this time is government. We're talking about the First Amendment, government banning speech, censoring speech. So when schools, often it seems only one person is raising a book or so, in Florida at least, ban a book. That's government doing that. When Congress, as they have, would say during the financial crisis inquiry commission, Republicans banned talk about a specific thing that they didn't want, some regulation, talk about climate change. Again, in Florida, Republicans, again, banning the word climate change. That's what and to say they're banning or preventing these petitions against slavery. Steve, when I read that in your book, I was like, that's crazy, but I feel like there's some sense of that today. And maybe it's...
Yeah, no, there's a lot of that around today. And it's really hard to deal with. And I understand, I mean, the point of view of people who think this idea is like dangerous and wrong, or this language is offensive to me personally. I should not have to endure this language. And, I'm not in favor of going around and insulting people by all means. But you do need to discuss ideas. You need to discuss concepts. And it's amazing to think that banning of the anti-slavery petition was not the only kind of restriction on speech in the era of slavery. There was even censorship of the mails. Postmasters in the South were authorized and allowed, if they noticed like anti-slavery petitions coming through in the mail, just burn them, get rid of them, get them out of there because they were considered dangerous.
Right.
It was, again, equating speech with violence, which is something that we would like to think that we don't stand for in the United States.
We would like to think that. Steve, I think also you point out about how Abraham Lincoln would often, he reminded me of a stand-up comic here, or that generation's version of it, at least. He would tell these stories. He would tell jokes. You read about a poop joke he once told, which I thought was hilarious. And grotesque. I was very sensitive. Well, when reading Differ, I was very offended during that section of Differ We Must. But hey, listen, it's historically accurate.
Okay, well,
really I would have wanted a trigger warning about that story. But Steve, the point I'm making is, like, when we saw this in Spielberg's Lincoln, he would tell a lot of jokes, and he would do that to humanize himself, to humanize the other people. And people would see that tactic coming. But that's my fear. I've found myself sometimes dehumanizing people I disagree with. And that, to me, is where a lot of us, including on the left, I see so much of this, and I try not to traffic in it, but every once in a while I do, dehumanizing people. And I think Lincoln understood that wouldn't work. Tell me some examples of how he used that type of behavior to introduce himself to people. Be like, I'm a human. I'm a person. You have to talk to me. You can't then burn me down tomorrow.
Wow. You've done it almost better than I can. But he did not engage in personal invective. I gave you the example already about even slave owners. He could not have disagreed more about them, yet remained friends with some people. And I understand why somebody might say that's awful. I would never do that. I would never associate with this person. But he tried to keep in mind the whole person, the whole human being. And he did present himself as a whole human being. He was modest. He was humble. This is a weird thing to explain, Pete, but I think you'll understand. His humility came from a place of self-confidence. He knew how smart he was, so he didn't have to prove to you how smart he was. You know what I'm saying? And he also enjoyed people, enjoyed talking, and would use that sense of humor. And he would relate to people on lots of different levels. And he would make friends with people in the other party. And sometimes that might have just been like kind of a professional friendship, like I'm going to be polite to you, even though I know you're a jerk. But sometimes it was a genuine friendship. I think his humor is key to all of this because he was getting at things that we commonly understand that make us human. And that's where a lot of the kind of, have these absurd stories he would tell that are really hard to even reproduce now. But they were about being a little silly, a little absurd, and, plays of logic and so forth.
Man, I really, I'll be honest with you at this point in our conversation, when the publicist for the publisher reached out and said, would you be interested in interviewing Steve Inskeep? He's written, yes. Like, it didn't matter what you wrote. It's like, it's Steve Inskeep. Of course, I love the guy. He's a brilliant journalist. He's written other books of history. I'll talk to that guy about anything.
Thanks.
And then when I see that it's a book about Lincoln, I'm like, all right, cool. It sounds great. But it's a history book and I'm always wanting to be relevant, whatever. And then I read it because I'm going to interview Steve Inskeep. And I'm telling you, the book is making me a better person, a better husband, a better father, and most importantly, a better host and moderator, because I find myself degrading and taking steps backward because I'm so reactionary and passionate. And when I read Lincoln being able to work with people he detested and even be friends with them to get other things done, or the longer game, and that he could think that way. Boy, it's had a real effect on me in the way some of my self-help books. I'm not going to lie to you. I was not expecting this, Steve Inskeep.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you. I love that. I'm really happy to hear that. And it's the thing that I hope to hear. The
problem that I worry about is that people don't want to get things done. And so I wonder about some in today's Republican Party, specifically in this latest government shutdown fight, because we're talking about Republicans versus Republicans. And it would seem, and I've seen, I think Paul Krugman wrote this and others, and obviously I'm an unapologetic progressive. You are an objective journalist. We don't know your personal view. If you're a good journalist, and you are, I think you're painfully fair in my mind. But my concern is that they're nihilists. That's what Krugman said. That's what, they don't want to get anything done. They want to burn everything down. And I'm sure you have a thoughtful take on that.
I would say that if confronted with people who don't want to get anything done, who think burn it down or shut it down, the saving grace to an extent is democracy, in that you do not need to persuade everyone to be reasonable. You need to persuade a majority to be reasonable, a majority to be reasonable most of the time. And of course, there are circumstances where a majority is not enough, because we have this republic with all these separations of powers, and one justice can do a lot of damage from your point of view, or a handful of lawmakers can do a lot of damage if everybody's partisan and their party sticks together. But the challenge of Congress right now is to figure out a way to just do their business, to do their job. And really, there's enough of them who want to pass something by September 30th that they ought to be able to pass something by September 30th. And it's a matter of them recognizing their numbers. I mean, there was a Republican who I think was speaking just yesterday saying, it's kind of amazing the way that he phrased it. Maybe it's time. It's terrible we have to do this, but maybe it's time for us to reach across the aisle. Because if you're in this partisan fight, which you are in the House of Representatives, if you're in there, that's a hard thing to think about sometimes. But really, they do collaborate across the aisle on a lot of measures. And we may reach a point where probably will reach a point where they're going to have to collaborate across the aisle on this matter of the budget just to get basic business done. So that's democracy. We'll see if they do it.
Yeah, and they do certainly on a lot of things that we don't hear about, and it gets no attention because frankly, they're doing their job. And certainly, I think a lot gets done on the local and state level across partisan lines too. But we hear about the bitter fights, and we should. But I sometimes think that people aren't recognizing how well government is working, and to me, that's important that we do, because, well, I'm a person who thinks government is important and necessary. Let's get back though to your book for one more chapter. And maybe I'll let you pick. It is your book, and I'm not done with it. And I kind of wanted to go to some of the obvious ones, but there's a bunch of names that people don't know in here. So maybe pick one more and tell us about what Lincoln did in this negotiation, this relationship, this disagreement to get to some common ground or some progress, at least for him.
I'll tell you about a mind-bending one that's toward the end, and I guess I'll spoil it for you. Mary Ellen Wise, one of several women who were in the book, and her identity is a little bit obscure, but her own story about herself was that at the beginning of the war, she wanted to go to war, and she pretended to be a man, dressed like a man, and enlisted in a volunteer regiment in Northeast Indiana, up near Fort Wayne, Indiana, and actually did fight and was wounded. Her story is really hard to verify, and it's true of any number of women who did this because, of course, they're hiding their identity and so forth. In fact, there are reasons to doubt large parts of her story. But there is no question that hundreds of women were found in Union uniforms and Confederate uniforms during the war. There were women who said, I want to serve my country. I want to serve a cause larger than myself. I want to be part of the excitement. I want to see the world. I want to get off this farm where I'm unhappy. Any number of motivations. I might be an awesome warrior. Yeah, exactly. I might be really good at this. And they had any number of reasons to want to serve, and they did. And this particular woman, Mary Ellen Wise, appeared in Lincoln's office at the White House in 1864 and said, I fought, I was wounded, I did various things, and now I deserve my back pay. And the Army paymaster is not giving my back pay. And Lincoln was not able to verify this person's story particularly. And in researching it, it's clear that some of the things that she said were not true. It's only a question of how much of it was untrue. But he nevertheless wrote her a note to take to the Army paymaster saying, pay this woman, and if it turns out there's anything improper about it, I'll cover it myself. And then there was a former congressman who was in the office for this, who seems perhaps to have ushered Mary Ellen Wise in. He made sure the newspapers found out about it. And so this news story got out about Abraham Lincoln being supportive of the cause of a woman, and being supportive of the cause of anybody who was willing to fight for their country. And it was something that he could use to spread his image to the public, to give a richer sense of himself to the public, and to be supportive of women who've been very prominent in the anti-slavery cause. And so there was this totally, to his mind, to his perspective as a 19th century man, weird person who was doing this very strange and transgressive thing. And he's like, I got you. I understand what you're doing. I'm in. Let's do this. And there are examples like that throughout the book where he is just looking at someone who's maybe doesn't have a disagreement in every case, but is very different from him, and he's finding some way to make value out of that.
Did he say and also leak this to the newspapers?
I don't have a quote where he says link this to the newspaper, but he's there with his former congressman friend, Charles Case. And Charles Case goes in his own name and gives it to the newspaper. I don't see any way that Case does this if he doesn't have Lincoln's blessing. You know,
I am so happy to talk to you. I have a million questions about your life and career and your opinions on media and so on. And I hope we can do this another time if you can fit it between hosting the most popular radio shows in America and writing books. But I do want to ask Steve Inskeep,
sure.
You just off the book, just because you just dropped, and I think it's a pretty big deal. You just interviewed Volodymyr Zelensky in New York at the UN. He was here. You guys talked 40 minutes? I watched it. And I just wonder what your takeaway of him. You write about Lincoln, you study Lincoln, you interview this guy. You're a great journalist, and journalists are psychologists in a way. And I wonder what you took away from him as a person or anything else that he said. It's such a huge moment for you, for the audience to hear those interviews. And I'm not sure if you've interviewed a wartime leader during war like him ever before. I just wonder what your measure of him was, or what you would want to say about what you learned.
Yeah. A wartime leader like him, when has there ever been a person exactly like him? It's kind of wild, isn't it?
I mean, you've had a long career, so maybe, I don't know.
No, I've interviewed lots of people in war zones and so forth, but to find a person of that particular background, the former comedian who becomes president of a country just before it is invaded, is pretty wild. There are some parallels to draw with Lincoln, though. I think he has understood very well the symbolism of his position, as Lincoln did. You think about Lincoln's beard. He grew his beard when he was president-elect. Nice beard, by the way, Pete.
Thank you.
And just like, it made his face. It made him, it was like a symbol of who he was. And Zelensky's got his army uniform, right? He's never wearing a suit. He's wearing, the army sweatshirt. He's wearing the olive green pants, and he has grown a beard himself, by the way, and he just looks like he's resolute and in the fight. And he understands that the symbolism of him being alive and free and defiant and with his countrymen and women is probably more important than whatever individual thing he would say. He also has a sense of humor, as Lincoln did. So there are a lot of parallels. And he also, I'll make this analogy as well, he needs to work with a great number of people in Ukraine and world leaders that he disagrees with. I don't think that he believes that anybody in the United States and Europe is quite sending all of the help that he would like.
Right.
But he knows that he needs to get everything that he can out of any friend that he can, which is a lesson for us all.
I'm listening to you closely. What I'm hearing is that you're saying that I am a lot like Lincoln and Zelensky.
That's exactly where I was going with this. Yeah.
I'm sorry I interrupted you. If that's what you were going to.
No. You took the words right out of my mouth.
I'm just like, well, I certainly want to be. In reading this book, that's the point. I want to be more like that, which I think that if there were the shortest possible word, it would be thoughtful. For good, for evil, whatever, to get to, a better place, to get something, you have to be more thoughtful. And he certainly was. And that's, I think, my big takeaway. Steve, I really appreciate you joining me.
Thank you. I really enjoyed this too, Pete.
Congratulations. And I hope that we get to talk again. Let me hold it up again. I took the cover off the book.
Love it.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you.
All right. What do you think? Steve Inskeep. Pretty cool. Great conversation. I hope it didn't sound too much like a kiss ass, but I love the book. I'm still reading it and enjoying it immensely. I hope that he'll come back and share his appearance here on Stand Up with his massive following, because that was great. You'll be able to watch that interview as well on YouTube. I'll throw it up there on youtube.com/standupwithpete. If you're a subscriber, you'll get a link to that YouTube page. You can go watch the Hangout from Friday night as well. And you can always listen to the show on YouTube, because the show loads there each and every day as well. Well, that's all I've got for you. Be sure to tune in tomorrow when I'm going to be having the host of my favorite podcast, 10% Happier, Dan Harris, scheduled to sit down with me on Monday, and I'll have that on the Tuesday show here on Stand Up. So really very much been anticipating, looking forward to that. He's made a huge impact in my life for years. Talked to Dan several times, and I'm pretty friendly with him, so I'm very excited and a little bit nervous because I want to get that right, to be talking with Dan Harris. Well, that's all I've got for you on today's episode. Thank you so much for joining me, for supporting me, for subscribing, for writing a review to the podcast, and I will talk to you tomorrow. John Carroll taking us out today, and of course, don't forget to go watch his new video in support of all those organized labor, especially on strike, Union Made. Check that out. There's a link to it in the show notes as well. John, I'm done talking. Take it away.
They'll begin to listen when you start making sense and you stand up, stand up. No need to point your rifle to defend your town, just stand up, stand up. You know they can't deny you what you're laying down. Boy, you better stand up, stand up. Show your face of every color, yellow, black, red, and brown. She's the place where every lost child will finally be found. There's only one thing to do before we stand our ground, and that's stand up, stand up. Well, the founding fathers saw a land for all. They had to stand up, they had to stand up. They had a keen imagination for a crystal ball, drawing all the plans of a stand up. But all they had to go on was the time they were in, with other causes for laws, and since they weren't even sin, they knew that change was gonna come before the change could begin. They had to stand up. All right. it's a lie. Why you lying awake wondering where the money all went? It'll be the cost of freedom that'll go unspent. You can see them flee the scene of that experiment if you stand up. Alright, we got to speak up, we got to reach up and raise your voice in every way you know how. Don't be toes up, you got to show up. Ain't no better time to do it but now. No need to pledge allegiance to no wanton tribe. Rise up, show obedience to the voice inside. And listen well and it'll tell you not to run and hide. It says stand up.